Welcome, dear friends, to a gentle journey into the ancient and sacred world of the Guardians. This is a world where light and shadow dance in harmony, where bonds are forged in the quietest of moments, and where the protectors of realms carry the weight of eternal promises. Tonight, we will travel through the lore of these timeless guardians, learning of their beginnings, their trials, their triumphs, and the unbreakable oaths they made to safeguard the realms they loved. As you drift with me through their stories, allow yourself to be wrapped in the peaceful embrace of their enduring legacy, a legacy that echoes across time, waiting for those who listen. Take a deep breath and feel the stillness that surrounds us now. Feel your body soften with each exhale and let go of the weight you've carried today. The world of the Guardians is one of quiet strength, of battles fought in silence and peace found in the most unlikely of places. As we step into their world, let your thoughts wander and your mind drift into restful quiet. And if you enjoy drifting through stories like this, you're welcome to softly subscribe and share where you're listening from tonight. Now, let's begin our journey. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let the stories of the Guardians guide you gently to sleep. In the beginning, before time as we know it took shape, there existed only the endless void, a space untouched by the hands of fate where light and shadow swirled in an eternal dance. It was in this void, this cradle of creation, that the Guardians were born. But they were not born of flesh and bone, nor were they conceived by the will of a single being. They emerged from the very essence of the realms, formed by the energy of the stars, the whispers of the winds, and the silence of the deep oceans. The first Guardians were not many. They were but a handful, each one a protector forged from the elements of the worlds they would soon guard. The first of them, named Lyra, was a being of light, a shining figure whose presence was felt as warmth in the coldest corners of the realms. She was the embodiment of hope, the spark that would ignite the hearts of those in need. Her companion, Solace, was the embodiment of shadow, not as a force of darkness, but as a counterbalance, a necessary force to maintain the harmony of the realms. Together, they were the first to feel the call to protect, to serve as the first line of defense against the unknown forces that threatened the worlds. As the stars continued their dance across the heavens, other guardians began to form. Each was born with a unique connection to the realms they would watch over. Some were tied to the earth, strong and unyielding, while others found their strength in the air, swift and untouchable. There were those who emerged from the depths of the oceans, their power drawn from the silent flowing currents, while others felt the pulse of fire within their veins, burning brightly, tirelessly. With each new guardian, the balance of the world shifted, for they were not simply warriors, but keepers of peace, guardians of balance. In the earliest days, there were no kingdoms, no battles to fight. The guardians wandered the lands, listening to the whispers of the earth and the winds, observing the delicate balance of life. It was in these early moments of peace that the guardians formed their first bonds with the creatures of the realms. They would watch over the animals that roamed the forests, the birds that flew high in the sky, and the fish that swam in the oceans. Their role was not to conquer, but to guide, to nurture, and to protect. They were the silent witnesses to the first breath of life. Yet even in this peaceful time, There was an undercurrent of something far greater than what the Guardians could understand. It was a force that had existed long before their creation, an ancient presence that watched from the shadows. This force, known only as the Void, had remained dormant for eons, content in its slumber. But as the Guardians grew stronger, the Void began to stir. The peace that the Guardians so carefully cultivated was about to be tested in ways they could not yet imagine. The first stirrings of conflict came not in the form of an enemy, but in the form of doubt. Lyra, the embodiment of light, began to feel the weight of her responsibilities press down on her. She had long carried the burden of hope, and the fear of failure began to creep into her heart. Solace, her companion in both light and shadow, tried to soothe her, reminding her of the bond they shared. Together, they were unbreakable. Together, they would stand as the guardians of all that was good. But the darkness within the void, the creeping uncertainty that threatened to unravel everything, began to chip away at their resolve. The other guardians, too, began to feel the weight of their tasks. Though they were beings of immense power, they were still learning, still growing into their roles. The force of the void, ancient and unyielding, was patient, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The guardians' strength came not from their power alone, but from the unity they shared. It was through their bonds that they would remain strong, through their connection to the realms they protected, that they would find their true purpose. As the guardians walked their paths, a quiet understanding began to form among them. They were not invincible, they were not perfect, but they were necessary. The realms they guarded were fragile, delicate, and it was their duty to preserve that fragility. The guardians had no need for grand gestures or epic battles. Their role was in the quiet moments of protection, in the unseen actions that kept the realms in balance. Yet in the midst of this stillness, a question lingered. What would happen if the peace they fought so hard to maintain were shattered? What if the force of the void, the ancient presence that had long waited, finally awoke? Lyra, Solace, and the others could not answer these questions, for they had not yet seen the true scope of the threat that lay ahead. But the first seeds of conflict were being sown. The realms were about to change, and so too would the role of the guardians. What they had once thought to be their greatest strength, unity, and peace, would soon be tested. And as the void stirred, so too did the guardians' understanding of what it meant to protect, what it meant to truly stand guard over something so precious. Their journey had only just begun. The first signs of change came quietly, almost imperceptibly. The guardians, who had spent centuries walking in the light, felt the pull of something deeper, something far older than the realms they had been tasked to protect. At first, it was a subtle shift, a murmur in the wind, a flicker of light where there had been none before. But as the days passed, this sensation grew stronger. It was as if the fabric of reality itself was beginning to tremble, ever so slightly, beneath the weight of an unseen force. It was Solace, the embodiment of shadow, who first sensed it. He had always been attuned to the subtle currents of the realms, listening to the whispers in the dark corners where others dared not tread. For centuries, he had been content to watch from the edges, his presence silent and steady. But now, something had changed. A growing darkness crept into the shadows he once commanded. It was not an enemy that threatened them, but a presence, a cold, ancient force that seemed to wrap itself around the edges of the worlds the Guardians had sworn to protect. Solace turned to Lyra, his closest companion, his voice a quiet whisper in the stillness of their shared vigil. "Do you feel it?" he asked, his words laced with a quiet urgency. "There is something lurking, something old and yet not of the realms." Lyra, ever the beacon of hope, felt the weight of his words, though she struggled to understand their meaning. She had always believed that light could conquer anything, that the warmth she carried within her would shield them from the darkness. But now, for the first time, she felt a chill, something that no amount of light could warm. It was as though her radiant power had been dimmed by an invisible force. "I do," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "But what is it? Where does it come from?" The two stood together in silence, the vastness of the worlds stretching out before them. Neither of them could answer the questions that echoed in their minds. They knew, however, that they were no longer the only ones who had sensed the shift. The other guardians, too, had begun to feel it. It was a quiet stirring, a gentle tug in their hearts, urging them to look deeper, to listen more intently. It was in this moment of shared uncertainty that the first of the guardians spoke of the visions they had begun to experience. Ilara, a guardian of the waters, had always been one to follow the rhythm of the tides. But recently, the waters had been restless, their once calm surfaces rippling with unseen forces. She had seen strange visions in the depths, dark shapes moving beneath the waves, and heard voices carried on the currents, voices that spoke of a great awakening, a reckoning that was yet to come. "We are not the only ones who are waking," Ilara said, her voice soft but tinged with fear. "There are others. The realms stir, but so does the darkness. It is no longer just a shadow in the distance. It is coming closer." The guardians gathered around Ilara, their faces drawn with concern. They had long known that their purpose was to protect, but now the question loomed over them. What were they protecting, and against what? They had never faced an enemy like this before. The darkness was not a force they could fight with swords or shields. It was something deeper, something ancient that had been lying in wait for eons, ready to awaken when the time was right. The first sign of what lay ahead came one night when the realms trembled. It began as a soft quake, a gentle rumble beneath the earth that grew into a cacophony of shattering sound. The very foundations of the worlds seemed to shift, as though the realms themselves were being torn apart from within. In the sky above, the stars flickered and dimmed, their light waning as if something unseen was slowly swallowing the light of the heavens. The guardians knew in that moment that the time had come. The darkness was no longer a whisper in the distance. It was at their doorstep, and they would have to face it together. But as they gathered in the center of their sacred circle, a wave of doubt washed over them. They had never been tested like this before. What if they failed? What if their strength was not enough to protect the realms they had vowed to guard? Lyra, standing at the heart of the gathering, lifted her gaze to the sky. She felt the weight of her oath pressing upon her chest, the promise she had made to protect the light of the realms. The burden was heavier than ever before, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead gnawed at her. But as she looked to her companions, Solace, Ilara, and the others, she felt something stir within her. It was a warmth, a quiet flame that refused to be extinguished. They were the guardians. They had always stood in the light, and they would continue to do so, no matter how dark the world became. They had faced countless challenges, and though this new threat was unlike anything they had ever known, they would not falter. "We will face this together," Lyra said, her voice steady despite the turmoil that churned within her. "We are not alone in this. The realms are ours to protect, and we will fight for them, no matter what." Her words, soft yet resolute, seemed to echo across the gathering. The other guardians nodded, each one drawing strength from the unity they shared. They were bound by their oath, by their duty, and by the deep connections they had forged over centuries. They had faced trials before, but this would be the greatest test of all. The force that stirred within the realms was something unknown, something ancient, and yet they would stand against it. As they stood together, ready to face the darkness, the first true test of the Guardians began. The darkness was no longer a shadow in the distance, it was here. The first wave had arrived, and it was more powerful than anything the Guardians could have imagined. But as the realms trembled and the stars dimmed, one truth remained, is that the Guardians would rise, and their awakening would not be in vain. The stillness of the realms was shattered by the presence of the void, an ancient force that had long slumbered beneath the fabric of existence. Its awakening was not marked by explosions or grand displays of power, but by a creeping shadow that spread through the hearts of the guardians. It was not a force they could see, but one they could feel, a coldness, a dissonance in the harmony they had so carefully cultivated. The air grew heavy, as though the very atmosphere was thickening with the weight of something long forgotten. In the face of this unseen threat, the guardians gathered in their sacred circle, a place where time seemed to stand still, untouched by the passing of the worlds. Here they had sworn their oaths, binding themselves to the realms and each other. They had pledged to protect the balance, to guard the realms from the forces that would seek to tear them apart. But now, with the void stirring, those oaths were about to be tested as never before. The guardians had long known the significance of their promises. They had sworn to protect the realms, to watch over the creatures that roamed the lands, to ensure that the light never faded from the worlds they held dear. These oaths were not made lightly, for they were bound by the deepest magic, forged in the hearts of the first guardians. It was said that the strength of their bonds was what had kept the realms in harmony for so long. Yet now, as the void pressed closer, those bonds seemed fragile, threatened by a force beyond their understanding. Lyra, the guardian of light, stood at the forefront of the circle, her presence as radiant as the dawn. Her eyes were filled with a quiet determination, yet even she could not ignore the doubt that lingered at the edges of her mind. She had always believed in the power of light to overcome any darkness, but the void was different. It was not a darkness that could be dispelled with a single burst of radiance. It was a force that sought to unravel the very fabric of the realms themselves, to twist the balance into something unrecognizable. The weight of her oath pressed heavily on her shoulders. She had sworn to be the beacon of hope, the light that would guide the way through the darkest of times. But now she was not so sure if light alone could stand against the ancient forces that were stirring beneath the surface of the realms. She glanced at her fellow guardians, searching their faces for reassurance, but saw only the same quiet resolve mirrored in their expressions. Solace, the guardian of shadow, stood beside her, his dark form blending with the shadows that seemed to stretch out from the very ground beneath their feet. He, too, was bound by the same oath, but his connection to the realms was different. Where Lyra was the light, Solace was the counterbalance, the necessary darkness that kept the realms in check. His oath was one of quiet protection, a vow to guard the unseen places where shadows lingered, where secrets were kept, and where the balance could so easily be tipped. He turned to Lyra, his voice low but steady. We made our vows long ago, Lyra, and those vows still hold. No matter the darkness, no matter the storm that comes, we stand together. The oath we swore is not just a promise to protect, it is a promise to one another. We are stronger together than we are apart. His words, though simple, carried a weight that settled in the hearts of the other guardians. They knew that Solace was right. Their oaths were not just words spoken in the quiet of the circle. They were bonds, forged through centuries of shared purpose and sacrifice. They had stood together through countless trials, and they would stand together now. Each of the guardians had their own oath, their own vow that was uniquely tied to the realms they protected. Ilara, the guardian of the waters, had sworn to protect the seas and the creatures that lived within them. Her oath was one of fluidity, of adapting to the ever-changing tides of the oceans. She was the one who could calm the storms and bring the waters back to a peaceful state when the currents grew turbulent. Her connection to the oceans was deep, and her oath was a promise to keep the balance of life within the waters, to ensure that the flow of life never ceased. Zephyros, the guardian of the winds, had pledged to safeguard the skies, to ensure that the winds would always blow freely, carrying the whispers of the realms from one end to the other. His oath was one of freedom and movement, a promise to never let the winds be stilled, to never allow the air to grow stagnant. His was a vow to keep the currents of the world flowing, to ensure that the voices of the realms would always be heard. And then there was Igna, the guardian of flame, whose oath was one of passion and destruction. She had sworn to protect the sacred fire, to ensure that it would never go out. The flame she guarded was not a destructive force, but one of creation, of warmth, of life. It was through the fire that new things were born, and it was through the flame that the old would be consumed. Her oath was to keep the flame burning bright, to ensure that the light of creation would never fade into darkness. Each of the guardians had sworn their oath in the presence of the realms, binding themselves to the balance of the world. And now, as the void pressed closer, they understood that those oaths would be tested as never before. The time had come for them to reaffirm their vows, to remind themselves of the promises they had made and the strength they drew from one another. Together, they would face the coming storm. Together, they would protect the realms from the force that sought to consume them. Lyra raised her head, her gaze steady as she looked at each of the guardians in turn. We stand together, she said, her voice clear and unwavering. Our oaths are not just words, they are the bond that holds us together. The darkness may come, but it will not break us. We will stand firm, and we will protect what is ours. And so, with their oaths renewed, the guardians prepared for the trials that lay ahead. The void was coming, but they would not falter. They would stand side by side as they had always done, and together they would face the darkness. As the guardians stood united in the face of the rising darkness, they felt the weight of their purpose pressing gently but firmly upon their shoulders. The oaths they had sworn had bound them to one another, and it was through their unity that they drew their strength. No longer would they be solitary protectors of the realms, scattered across the lands in their quiet vigilance. Now, their bond was the very foundation upon which their victory would be built. The circle was the heart of the Guardian's power. It was not simply a formation, a gathering of beings. It was the living embodiment of their shared purpose. In the quiet of the circle, the Guardians were not just protectors. They were a family, a united force against the darkness that threatened to unravel the world they held dear. It was within the circle that they felt the pulse of the realms, the heartbeat of the earth, the wind, the fire, and the water. Together, they were an unbreakable chain, each link a testament to the strength of their connection. In the center of the circle stood Lyra, the guardian of light, her presence as radiant as the sun's first rays at dawn. She was the beacon, the light that would guide them through the coming storm. Her resolve was steadfast, yet the burden she carried was not one she bore alone. She could feel the weight of her companions' eyes upon her, their unspoken trust and belief in her ability to lead, and she would not falter. Beside her stood Solace, the guardian of shadow, whose quiet strength balanced the brilliance of her light. He was not the opposite of Lyra, but the complement. Where light could blind, shadow brought clarity. His duty was to protect the unseen, to guard the spaces between the realms, where the flow of time and energy was most fragile. The balance they maintained, light and shadow, was delicate yet powerful, and together they were the foundation of the circle. Each of the other guardians stood in their place, drawn into the circle by the strength of their own oaths. Ilara, the guardian of the waters, stood with her feet in the cool, flowing stream that had come to symbolize her bond with the depths of the oceans. The waters were ever changing, flowing with grace and unpredictability, yet they were also patient and unyielding. She was the embodiment of fluidity, and her oath was one of adaptability. She would bend with the currents, but never break. Zephyros, the guardian of the winds, stood just beyond the edge of the circle, his eyes turned to the heavens above. The winds that danced around him were ever present, whispering the stories of distant lands and unseen places. His connection to the air was one of freedom, and his vow was to ensure that the winds would never be stilled, that the voices of the realms would always be heard, no matter how faint. He was the breath of life, the carrier of dreams and messages. Igna, the guardian of flame, stood near the center of the circle, her gaze fixed upon the flickering flame that burned eternally at her side. Her oath was one of passion, of creation and destruction. The flame she guarded was not just a fire, it was the spark of life itself, the light that would burn brightly through even the darkest times. It was through her fire that the world was reborn, and it was through her fire that the old was consumed, making way for the new. Together, they formed the circle, a powerful, unyielding unity that transcended the realms. Their strength was not in their individual power, but in the collective bond they shared. They were not separate guardians, standing alone against the storm. They were one, woven together by their oaths, their shared history, and the love they had for the worlds they protected. In the stillness of the circle, the guardians knew that they would need more than just their individual strengths to face the darkness that approached. The void was not a force that could be defeated by light alone, or by shadow, or by flame. It was a force that sought to unravel the very fabric of existence, to sever the bonds that held the realms together. To defeat it, they would need the unity of their hearts, the combined strength of their spirits, and the shared belief that the light, the air, the water, and the fire could stand against the storm. As the first tremors of the void's presence rippled through the circle, the guardians felt a deep sense of quiet resolve settle within them. They had sworn their oaths, and now they would hold to them together. They would face whatever came, not as individuals, but as a family. The circle was their strength, their protection, their home, and within it they would remain united, no matter the darkness that threatened to engulf them. Lyra took a deep breath, her heart steady and sure. Together, she said softly, her voice resonating through the circle, we are stronger than any force, any darkness, any shadow. We are the guardians. We will protect the realms, and we will protect one another. Solace, standing by her side, placed a hand gently on her shoulder. We are bound by our oaths, he replied, his voice a whisper in the wind. And as long as we stand together, nothing can break us. And so, with their hearts aligned and their spirits united, the guardians prepared to face the darkness that approached. It would not be an easy fight, and the road ahead would be fraught with trials, but they would face it as one. The circle would remain unbroken, and together they would protect the realms from the storm that was about to unfold. The guardians had long stood watch over the realms, their strength and unity unchallenged by the forces of nature or the mysteries of the cosmos. But now, as the void pressed closer, they were confronted by something far more insidious than any force they had encountered before. It was not a physical battle that awaited them, but a trial of the spirit, a test that would challenge the very core of their being. The first of the trials came without warning, like a storm on the horizon, dark and relentless. It began as a whisper, a murmur of doubt that curled into the hearts of the guardians, tugging at the very foundation of their unity. It was subtle at first, small, fleeting thoughts that passed like shadows in the corners of their minds. But soon, those whispers grew louder, more insistent. They began to question their purpose, their oaths, and their ability to protect the realms they had sworn to defend. For Lyra, the guardian of light, the trial was one of self-doubt. She had always been the beacon of hope, the shining light that guided the way through the darkest of times. But now, with the void so close, she found herself questioning her own strength. What if the light she carried could not hold back the darkness? What if the warmth she offered could not reach the deepest corners of the worlds they protected? The doubt gnawed at her, and for the first time in centuries, she felt vulnerable. Solace, the guardian of shadow, was not immune to the trial either. His connection to the unseen places, to the dark corners of the realms, was both his strength and his burden. He had always believed that the balance of light and shadow was what kept the realms in harmony. But now, as the void grew stronger, he began to wonder whether his role in maintaining the balance had been misguided. Was it possible that the darkness he had always protected was now turning against them. Was his purpose truly one of protection, or had he merely been a silent observer, content to stay in the shadows while the world around him fell apart? Ilara, the guardian of the waters, felt the trial in a different way. She had always been the one who flowed with the currents, who adapted to the ever changing tides of the oceans. Her connection to the water was one of fluidity and grace. But now she found herself questioning whether she had ever truly understood the depths of her role. The ocean was vast, ever changing, but beneath its surface there were forces that could not be controlled, no matter how much she adapted. Could she really protect the waters from the darkness that was now spreading? Was her role as the protector of the sea enough to stand against the storm that was coming? Zephyros, the guardian of the winds, struggled with the trial of freedom. The winds that he had once controlled so effortlessly now seemed wild, untamable. The air was thick with the presence of the void, and the winds that had always carried the whispers of distant lands now felt heavy, burdened. The freedom he had once taken for granted now felt like a distant memory, a fleeting dream. How could he protect the realms if he could no longer control the winds? How could he ensure the movement of life if the very breath of the world was now stifled by the encroaching darkness? Igna, the guardian of flame, faced a trial of passion. The fire she guarded had always burned brightly, a symbol of creation and renewal. But now, as the void spread across the realms, her flame began to flicker, its light dimming in the face of the darkness. The fire that had once been her strength now seemed fragile, like a candle in a storm. Could she continue to guard the flame, to protect the light of creation, when the very force she had sworn to protect it from was now threatening to snuff it out? Each guardian faced their own trial, their own moment of doubt and fear. The trials were not physical, they were emotional, spiritual, and deeply personal. They were forced to confront the very essence of their being, to question their purpose, their strength, and their resolve. The darkness they faced was not just an external force, it was a reflection of the fear and doubt that had always lurked in the depths of their hearts. But in the midst of these trials, there was a quiet understanding. The guardians had always been united by their oaths, but it was in the face of doubt that they would truly prove the strength of their bond. They were not perfect, nor were they infallible. They had always known that their purpose was not to fight the darkness with force alone, but to hold the balance, to protect the realms through their unity, their love, and their unwavering commitment to one another. It was in the quiet moments of reflection, when the weight of their trials seemed unbearable, that the guardians found their strength. They began to reach out to one another, not as individuals, but as a family, bound by their shared purpose. Lyra turned to Solace, her heart heavy with doubt, but her voice steady. "We will face this together," she said, her words carrying the weight of a promise. "We are not defined by our doubts, but by our strength to overcome them." Solus, though weighed down by his own uncertainties, nodded in agreement. "The darkness may try to break us, but it will not succeed. We are more than our fears. We are the guardians." Ilara, Zephyros, and Igna each spoke their own words of reassurance, their voices steady and sure. They had each faced their own trials, and though the road ahead was uncertain, they knew that their unity was their greatest strength. Together, they would stand against the darkness, not as individuals, but as a single force, unyielding and unbroken. The trials were not over, but the guardians had emerged from them stronger than before. They had faced their fears, their doubts, and their insecurities, and they had found the strength to stand together. The void might seek to divide them, to tear apart the unity they had worked so hard to build, but the guardians knew that as long as they stood together, there was no darkness that could defeat them. The shadows that had once been a mere whisper in the realms now took shape, becoming a presence that none could ignore. The void, once distant and intangible, had begun to manifest in ways that sent ripples of unease through the guardians. It was no longer content to remain in the depths, hidden away from the light. It was rising, stretching its tendrils into every corner of the realms, pulling at the very fabric of existence. The guardians, who had once been certain in their roles, now found themselves uncertain, unsure of how to fight an enemy that was not bound by form or substance. Lyra, the guardian of light, felt the darkness creeping closer, its cold fingers brushing against the edges of her heart. It was a force unlike any she had ever faced, a force that seemed to bend the very laws of nature to its will. Where once her light had been a beacon, now it felt like a flicker in a storm, struggling to keep the darkness at bay. The void did not fight with strength or violence. It fought with patience, with the slow, insidious erosion of hope. As the darkness spread, the guardians found themselves retreating to the safety of their circle. The world outside was changing, the realms shifting in ways that defied understanding. The waters that Alara had once commanded flowed with a strange, unnatural current. The winds that Zephyros had guided now howled in confusion, carrying with them the scent of something unknown. The fire that Igna had tended to flickered erratically, its warmth no longer as steady as it once had been. It was not just the physical world that was affected, but the very hearts of the guardians themselves. Their connection to the realms, their bond with the land, the sky, the sea, and the flame seemed to weaken with each passing day. The darkness was not something that could be fought with sword or flame. It was a force that sought to twist and distort the very essence of existence. Solace, the guardian of shadow, stood apart from the rest. His eyes narrowed as he studied the growing shadow that loomed on the horizon. He had always understood the balance between light and dark, but this was something different. This was not the natural ebb and flow of the realms, not the cyclical dance of night and day. This was an unnatural force, one that sought to consume everything in its path, leaving nothing but emptiness behind. "I can feel it," Solace murmured, his voice low and steady. "It is as though the darkness is everywhere now, not just in the hidden places, but in the very air we breathe." Lyra nodded, her gaze distant, her heart heavy with the weight of their situation. "The light cannot stand alone against this. It is not a battle we can win with our powers alone." Ilara, the guardian of the waters, stepped forward, her voice soft but filled with resolve. "Then we must find another way. We are more than our individual strengths. The strength of our bond, the circle we form, is our greatest weapon." Zephyros, who had been silent until now, looked to the horizon, his expression grim. "The winds carry the whispers of the realms, and they are full of fear. The void is spreading, and it is not just the physical world that is in danger. It is the very soul of the realms that is being torn apart." Igna, her eyes fierce and determined, stepped forward, her flame burning brighter than before. Then we must burn brighter still. The fire will not be extinguished by darkness. We are the guardians of the realms, and it is our duty to stand against this. The guardians stood together, their hands joined, their hearts united in purpose. The darkness was rising, and they knew that they could not stand idly by. They were not just protectors of the realms, they were the realms themselves. Each guardian was a part of the world they protected, and the world depended on them to stand firm, to fight for the light, the water, the wind, and the flame. But the darkness was not a force that could be confronted with brute strength. It was a slow, insidious force, one that sought to unravel everything the guardians had worked for. They could feel it pressing in on them, seeping into their very bones, whispering doubts into their hearts. It was a fight not just for the realms, but for the very essence of who they were. Lyra's light flickered, its brilliance dimmed by the encroaching shadows. She felt the weight of the void pressing against her, threatening to snuff out the very flame of hope she had carried for so long. But she refused to let it go. She would not let the darkness win. She raised her hand, the light burning brighter once again as she spoke with quiet determination. "We have always been united by our oaths," she said, her voice steady and filled with resolve. "And it is through that unity that we will defeat the darkness. We may face trials, we may face doubts, but we will not break. We are the guardians, and we will stand together." Solace, his shadow shifting around him like a living thing, nodded in agreement. "Together, we will face this. The darkness may rise, but we will stand firm. The balance will not be broken." The rest of the guardians joined their voices together, their words a quiet chorus of resolve. They had each faced their own doubts, their own fears, but now, in the face of the rising darkness, they knew what they had to do. They would stand as one, united against the force that sought to destroy all they had sworn to protect. And so, with the darkness looming ever closer, the guardians made their vow once again. They would not falter, they would not break, they would fight for the light, for the waters, for the winds, and for the flame. They would fight for the realms. The rise of darkness was not the end. It was only the beginning of the greatest trial the Guardians had ever faced. The realms, once bathed in the soft light of hope, were now tinged with the shadow of uncertainty. The void, having made its presence known, grew stronger with each passing day. The Guardians, once certain in their roles and unwavering in their oaths, found themselves confronted with a challenge unlike any they had faced before. The very core of the realms seemed to tremble beneath the weight of the darkness that pressed in from all sides. Yet even as the world around them began to shift and change, the Guardians clung to the legacy they had built, a legacy that stretched back to the first moment of creation. The legacy of the Guardians was not one of grandeur or fanfare. It was not marked by the monuments of kings or the songs of bards. Instead, it was a quiet, steady force that had been woven into the fabric of the realms, existing in the whispers of the winds, the ripples of the waters, the warmth of the fire, and the steady glow of the light. The Guardians had never sought recognition or fame. They had simply carried out their duty, watching over the realms, protecting the balance, and ensuring that the light never faded. But as the void grew, so too did the recognition of their role. The creatures of the realms, who had once been unaware of the Guardian's silent watch, now began to understand the magnitude of their duty. It was in the quiet moments, in the stillness of the night, when the creatures would pause and feel the weight of the Guardian's presence. They knew that without the Guardians, the worlds they inhabited would fall into chaos. The Guardian's legacy was one of protection, of quiet strength, and of an unwavering commitment to the balance of the realms. Lyra, the Guardian of Light, stood at the heart of the circle, her gaze distant as she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Her light had always been a symbol of hope, of warmth in the darkest of times. But now, as the darkness pressed closer, she wondered if her light was enough. She had always believed that light could conquer any darkness, but the void was different. It was not a force that could be driven back by the mere presence of light. It was a force that sought to consume everything, to swallow the realms whole, and to extinguish the very light she had sworn to protect. Yet as she stood there, with her fellow guardians by her side, she realized that her strength did not lie solely in the light she carried. It lay in the bond they shared, in the unity that had always been their greatest strength. Together, they were more than the sum of their parts. Together, they were a force that could withstand the darkness, no matter how great or insidious it might be. Solace, the guardian of shadow, stood beside her, his form blending seamlessly into the shadows that stretched out from the circle. He, too, had been reflecting on the legacy of the Guardians, on the oath they had sworn so many centuries ago. His connection to the shadows had always been a quiet one, a force that operated in the background, unseen and unnoticed by most. But now, in the face of the void, he understood the importance of his role. The darkness he guarded was not one to be feared. It was the necessary counterbalance to the light. Without shadow, there could be no light. Without darkness, there could be no dawn. The legacy we leave behind is not just in the battles we fight, Solace said softly, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of wisdom. It is in the choices we make, in the bonds we form, and in the protection we offer to those who cannot protect themselves. The realms may fall, but our legacy will remain in the hearts of those we have sworn to protect. Ilara, the guardian of the waters, nodded in agreement, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what was to come. The waters she guarded had always been a source of life, of renewal. The currents of the oceans flowed with grace, carrying the energy of the realms to places unseen. But now, as the void spread, she could feel the waters becoming still, their flow interrupted by the encroaching darkness. It was a sensation that sent a chill through her, a reminder that even the most peaceful of forces could be disrupted by the weight of the unknown. The legacy of the Guardians is not one of power, Ilara said, her voice a quiet murmur, but of balance. It is in the stillness of the waters, the quiet moments of peace, that we find the true measure of our strength. The void may seek to disturb that balance, but we will not let it. We will stand firm together. Zephyros, the guardian of the winds, stood with his eyes turned to the sky, his expression filled with determination. The winds he had once controlled so effortlessly now seemed wild, untamable. They carried with them the scent of the void, a heavy, oppressive air that weighed on his spirit. Yet even as the winds raged around him, he understood that his role was not to control the storm, but to guide it. The winds could not be contained, but they could be directed, shaped, and used to carry the message of the realms to those who needed it most. The winds carry our voices, Zephyros said, his tone firm and unwavering, and they will carry our legacy. The darkness may seek to silence us, but we will not be silenced. We will carry the message of the guardians to every corner of the realms, and we will ensure that our legacy lives on, no matter the storm. Igna, the guardian of flame, stood near the heart of the circle, her flame burning brightly despite the encroaching darkness. The fire she had always tended to flickered with a fierce intensity, its warmth a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was always light to be found. The flame had always been her strength, but now, as the void grew stronger, she realized that it was more than just a source of warmth. It was a symbol of hope, of renewal, and of the strength that could be found in even the most difficult of times. Our legacy is not one of destruction, Igna said, her voice steady and resolute. It is one of creation. The flame that burns within us is the same flame that will ignite the hearts of those who come after us. We will light the way, and our legacy will shine brighter than any darkness. As the guardians stood together, their hearts united by the legacy they carried, they knew that the path ahead would not be easy. The void was a force unlike any they had ever faced before, but the guardians understood that their legacy was not one of perfect victory, but of unwavering resolve, of standing firm in the face of darkness, and of protecting the realms no matter the cost. The realms would remember the guardians, not for the battles they fought, but for the love they carried for the worlds they protected. And in that love, they would find their strength. In all the centuries that the guardians had stood together, their bond had been unshakable. They had been forged in the crucible of duty and love for the realms they had sworn to protect. Yet, as the darkness of the void grew stronger, something darker still began to stir within the hearts of one among them. It was a force no one had anticipated, a force that threatened to fracture the circle and shake the very foundation of the Guardians' unity. It was the first betrayal, and it would forever alter the course of their journey. The signs were subtle at first: a lingering silence, an absent glance, an unspoken word. Lyra, the guardian of light, had always been the one to notice the smallest changes. Her light had always illuminated the paths of the guardians, guiding them when doubt threatened to cloud their way. But now she found herself searching the faces of her companions, wondering what lay behind their eyes, what thoughts they kept hidden beneath their solemn expressions. It was Solace, the guardian of shadow, who first noticed the shift within one of their own. He had always been attuned to the subtle currents of the realms, to the undercurrents of emotion and thought that flowed beneath the surface of their interactions. And though he had never been one to pry, he could not ignore the growing sense of unease that settled within him. There was a quiet tension in the circle, a shift in the air that hinted at something more sinister. Solace, Lyra whispered one evening, as the two of them stood apart from the others, watching the setting sun paint the sky with hues of gold and red. Have you noticed anything strange in the others? I feel distant from them, as though something is slipping away. Solace turned to her, his expression unreadable. I have, he said softly, but I do not know what it is, not yet. Something is changing. The void is not the only thing that threatens us now. For weeks, the Guardians had been growing stronger, united in their resolve to protect the realms from the encroaching darkness. But the shadows that had once been a silent ally now seemed to grow darker, more threatening. It was as though something had begun to fester within the circle, a rot that could not be seen but was slowly spreading through their ranks. It was during one of their quiet moments, when the circle had gathered to reflect on their oaths and prepare for the trials ahead, that the first betrayal was revealed. It was not a dramatic confession, nor was it a loud declaration of disloyalty. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like a crack in the foundation of their unity. But the moment it was revealed, it shattered the silence that had held the Guardians together for so long. Ilara, the Guardian of the Waters, was the first to speak. Her voice was soft, but there was an unmistakable edge to it, a tremor that betrayed the calm of her usually composed demeanor. "I have felt the pull of the void," she said, her eyes cast downward, her voice trembling. "I have felt it within me, pulling at my very core, and I am unsure if I can continue to fight against it." The words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment there was silence. The other guardians turned to Ilara, their expressions filled with shock and confusion. Ilara had always been the embodiment of fluidity, of grace. She had been the one to keep them grounded, to remind them of the importance of balance. But now her words cut to the heart of their unity, threatening to unravel everything they had built. Solace stepped forward, his shadow shifting with a subtle tension. "Ilara," he said softly, his voice a mixture of concern and disbelief. "What are you saying? You cannot truly mean this? The void is a force of destruction, but we have always stood together against it. You are one of us. You cannot—" But Ilara cut him off, her voice rising with an urgency that made the air around them crackle. "I feel it, Solace. I feel it in the water, in the depths of the oceans. The void is inside me. It is inside us all. It is twisting us, changing us. I I do not know if I can keep fighting against it. I do not know if I can stay true to our oaths." The words echoed in the hearts of the other guardians, and a deep silence fell over the circle. They had always believed that their unity, their bond, was unbreakable. They had trusted one another with their lives, their hopes, their very spirits. But now that trust seemed to be crumbling before them. Zephyros, the guardian of the winds, was the next to speak. His voice was tinged with sorrow, as though the weight of Ilara's words had struck him to his core. "Ilara," he said softly, "we have faced countless trials together. We have always stood united. We are more than just our individual strengths. We are the circle. We are the guardians. You cannot let the void take you from us." But Ilara shook her head, her eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed to mirror the growing darkness around them. "I wish it were that simple," she whispered. "I wish I could fight it. But the darkness, it is too powerful. I can feel it pulling me under. I cannot ignore it any longer." The betrayal was not in her words alone. It was in the quiet admission that the first crack had appeared in the unity of the Guardians. The void had found its way inside, not through force, but through doubt, through fear, through the very hearts of those who had sworn to protect the realms. And though Ilara had not yet fully succumbed to the darkness, her hesitation, her doubt, had planted the seed that would grow into a rift within the circle. The guardians stood in silence, each of them grappling with the weight of Alara's confession. The darkness had found its way inside, not as an enemy, but as a quiet whisper, a creeping presence that had begun to twist their resolve. It was a betrayal not of violence, but of the heart, a betrayal of the trust that had always held them together. The first betrayal had not come from an external force, but from within, and though the guardians knew they could not let it tear them apart, the road ahead would be more difficult than they had ever imagined. The moon, once a quiet observer in the night sky, had become a symbol of the guardians' struggle. Beneath its silvery glow, the realms seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the inevitable clash between light and shadow. For centuries, the moon had been a constant companion to the guardians, casting its gentle light upon the world, offering comfort and solace to those who sought refuge in the quiet of the night. It was the realm of the moon that held the deepest secrets, a place of reflection and transformation where the balance of the worlds was often decided in silence. Among the guardians, it was Ilara, the guardian of the waters, who felt the pull of the moon most strongly. The waters, after all, were bound to the cycles of the moon, rising and falling with its gravitational pull. The ebb and flow of the tides mirrored the waxing and waning of the moon itself, and Alara had always understood that the connection between the two was profound. The moon was both a guide and a guardian of the waters, a quiet sentinel that watched over the oceans, ensuring their tides were never too wild, never too calm. But now, as the void spread through the realms, the moon's once soothing light had begun to feel different. It was as though the moon itself was losing its connection to the realms, its light growing dimmer, its presence less certain. Ilara could feel the change in the waters. The tides were shifting, no longer following the natural rhythms they had once adhered to. The sea was restless, its once peaceful surface now disturbed by unseen forces beneath. As Alara stood on the shores of the ocean, her feet sinking into the wet sand, she gazed up at the moon, searching for some sign, some reassurance that all would be well. But the moon's light was faint, a mere whisper of the brilliance it had once held. The shadows of the void seemed to stretch across the sky, threatening to consume even the moon's radiant glow. Alara's heart ached, and for the first time in centuries, she felt a deep, overwhelming loneliness. She had always drawn strength from the moon, but now that strength seemed to be slipping away. Solace, she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of her thoughts. Do you feel it? The moon, it's fading. Solace, standing beside her, felt the pull of the moon as well. As the guardian of shadow, he had always been attuned to the cycles of light and darkness, the balance between the two. He knew that the moon was not just a celestial body, but a powerful force that maintained the harmony of the realms. It was a symbol of transformation, of quiet reflection, and of the subtle power that could shift the course of fate. But now, as Alara had said, the moon's light seemed weaker, more distant. I do, Solace said softly, his eyes reflecting the pale light of the moon. The darkness has spread further than we thought. The moon is our ally, but even it cannot escape the reach of the void. Ilara nodded, her gaze never leaving the moon. She had always believed that the light of the moon would guide them, even in the darkest of times. But now that light seemed to be slipping away, and with it, her confidence. If the moon, the one force that had always been steady, could be affected by the void, what hope did they have of defeating it? We must not let the moon's fading light be a symbol of our defeat, Solace said, his voice steady, but with an undercurrent of resolve. The moon has always held its own against the darkness, and so must we. We are guardians, and it is our duty to protect the light, no matter how faint it may seem. Alara took a deep breath, her heart steadying as she turned to Solace. His words, though simple, carried a weight of truth. The moon had never been about brilliance alone. It was a quiet, constant presence, offering light in the midst of the night. And just as the moon's light had always guided them, so too would their unity guide them through the darkness that threatened to consume the realms. You're right, she said softly. The moon is not just light, it is hope. And as long as we stand together, the darkness cannot take that away. Solace nodded, his shadow blending with the night around them. We are the guardians of more than just the realms. We are the guardians of hope. And as long as we hold that hope, no matter how small, we will continue to stand against the darkness. With these words, the guardians found renewed strength. The moon, though dim, was not defeated. Its light still held the power to guide them, to remind them of the balance they had sworn to protect. And though the void pressed closer, threatening to overrun all that they had fought for, the guardians knew that their unity would be the key to standing against it. Together, they would hold the light, no matter how faint it seemed. The moon's light might fade, but the flame within their hearts would burn brighter than ever before. They would not allow the darkness to win, not as long as they stood together. As the night deepened, the moon's light flickered faintly, casting long shadows across the oceans. Ilara stood, watching it with a renewed sense of purpose. The battle ahead would not be easy, but the Guardians were not alone. The realms had always been shaped by the forces of light and shadow, and it was through their balance that the world would survive. The Guardians of the Moon had always known that the path ahead would be fraught with challenges, but they also knew that their strength came not from the light of the moon, but from their unity. The darkness may rise, but it would not consume them. Together, they would protect the realms, and in doing so, they would preserve the hope that burned within the hearts of all who called the realms home. The flame burned brightly, casting a warm, flickering light that danced with the shadows. It had always been a symbol of hope, of renewal, of the strength that resided in creation itself. For Igna, the guardian of flame, the fire was more than just a source of light. It was her very essence, a manifestation of her unwavering will to protect and create. The flame had always been a constant companion, a force she could call upon whenever darkness threatened to consume the worlds she loved. But now, as the void pressed in on the realms, Igna felt the flame flicker, its once steadfast light dimming beneath the weight of the darkness. The flame was still there, but it was no longer the same. It seemed to waver, as if unsure of its place in a world that was being swallowed by the void. The fire that had once burned so brightly now seemed fragile, its warmth not enough to hold back the encroaching chill of the shadows. Igna stood before the fire, her hands extended, her fingers brushing the edges of the flame. She could feel its warmth, but it felt different now. It was no longer the fierce, unyielding fire she had always known. The darkness had begun to seep into it, twisting the flames and turning them into something unfamiliar, something that threatened to consume her very soul. But Igna refused to let the flame go out. She had sworn to protect it, to guard the light of creation with every ounce of her being. And though the darkness threatened to overpower her, she knew that as long as she held onto the flame, there would always be hope. The other guardians gathered around her, their faces somber, their hearts heavy with the weight of the growing darkness. They had all felt it, the slow erosion of their strength, the growing uncertainty that seemed to settle in the air like a heavy fog. But they had also felt something else, a sense of unity, of purpose that bound them together and refused to let them fall into despair. We cannot let the darkness take the flame. Lyra, the guardian of light, said softly, her voice steady, despite the uncertainty that plagued her own heart. The flame is more than just fire. It is the light within all of us. It is the hope that burns, even in the darkest times. Igna nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude at Lyra's words. The light of the Guardians had always been a guiding force, a beacon that shone even in the most turbulent of times. And though the flame flickered now, it was not gone. It still burned, however faintly, and as long as it did, there would be hope. You are right, Igna said, her voice stronger now, filled with determination. The flame will not go out. It cannot. It is the heart of creation, the spark that ignites all things. The void may seek to consume it, but it will not succeed. I will keep the flame burning no matter the cost. Solus, the guardian of shadow, stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. The flame is not just a source of light, Igna. It is a part of us all. The light you carry, the warmth you protect, is the very essence of creation. The void cannot destroy creation. It can only twist it. We must protect the flame, not with force, but with unity. It is our strength, and it is our legacy. Igna's eyes met Solus's, and for a moment she saw the quiet resolve that he had always carried within him. The shadows that had once seemed so distant were now a part of the Guardians, a necessary force to balance the light. They were not opposites, but complements, each playing a crucial role in maintaining the balance of the realms. You are right, Igna said, her voice softer now, but filled with conviction. The flame is not just mine to protect, it is all of ours. Together, we will keep it burning. Together, we will stand against the darkness. The other guardians nodded in agreement, their faces a reflection of the unity they had always shared. Ilara, the guardian of the waters, stepped forward, her gaze steady. The waters, too, have their place in the balance, she said softly. The tides may be restless, the currents may be disrupted, but the ocean will not be still forever. It will find its rhythm again, as will we. Zephyros, the guardian of the winds, spoke next, his voice carrying the same quiet strength. The winds may howl, the storms may rage, but the air will always move. The currents of the world will never be stilled, not as long as we stand together. Ilara's words echoed in Igna's heart, and she could feel the flame within her begin to burn more brightly. It was not just her flame to protect, but the flame of all the guardians, the flame of creation that burned in the heart of every realm. And though the darkness threatened to consume it, she knew that as long as they stood together, the flame would never go out. The guardians stood together, their hands joined, their hearts united. The flame burned brightly in Igna's hands, its light steady and strong. The darkness had not won. It could not win. As long as they held onto the flame, as long as they remained united, they would always have hope. The void may rise, Lyra said, her voice clear and unwavering, but it cannot extinguish the light. We will stand together, and we will protect the flame. The darkness cannot consume us, for we are the guardians, and we will never give up the fight. And so, with their hearts and spirits united, the guardians prepared to face the darkness once more. The flame burned brighter than ever, its light a beacon for all those who still held hope in their hearts. The void could not consume the flame, for it was the light that would guide them all. Together, they would protect the realms. Together, they would keep the flame burning. The realms were quiet now, their once vibrant landscapes muted under the shadow of the void. The sun seemed dimmer, the winds slower, and the waters were still, as though the very world held its breath. The guardians had stood strong through the growing darkness, their unity unwavering, yet they knew that the battle was far from over. The void had only begun to show its true form, and with it, a new and unsettling silence had descended upon the realms. A silence not born of peace, but of waiting, waiting for the inevitable clash, the moment when the darkness would reveal its true strength. Within the circle, the guardians gathered, their faces set with resolve, their hearts united in purpose. But there was an unease in the air, a tension that had not been present before. The presence of the void was no longer a distant threat, but a constant suffocating weight that pressed down upon the realms. It was as though the worlds themselves were listening, waiting for the next move, unsure of what the future would hold. Lyra, the guardian of light, stood at the edge of the circle, her gaze distant as she stared into the horizon. The light she carried had always been a source of hope, a beacon that guided the realms through their darkest moments. But now that light felt dimmer, weaker, as if the very force she had relied upon was being slowly drained. The void's touch was subtle, yet unyielding, and it was beginning to erode even the brightest of lights. She had always believed that the light could overcome any darkness, but now she felt the weight of doubt pressing down on her. What if the light was not enough? What if their unity, their strength, was not enough to defeat the void? She had never faced an enemy like this before, an enemy that did not fight with physical force, but with an insidious, creeping presence that sapped the strength of everything it touched. Solace, the guardian of shadow, stood beside her, his eyes reflecting the quiet unrest that filled the circle. As the guardian of shadow, he had always understood the delicate balance between light and darkness, knowing that both were necessary for the harmony of the realms. But even he could feel the unease that now lingered in the air. The shadows he had always been a part of now felt colder, more oppressive. They were no longer the quiet guardians of the unseen, but a silent witness to the growing storm that threatened to consume everything. "I feel it, too," Solace murmured, his voice low and steady. "The silence is not natural. It's as though the realms are holding their breath, waiting for something to happen." Lyra turned to him, so her eyes filled with the uncertainty she had been trying to keep at bay. What if the realms are not just waiting for something to happen? What if they are waiting for something to end? Solace did not answer immediately. He understood her fear, the fear that the darkness they faced was not something that could be fought with light or shadow alone. The void was not a force of destruction in the traditional sense. It did not tear, break, or annihilate. Instead, it was a force of quiet, insidious erosion, slowly consuming everything in its path until nothing remained but an empty void. The Guardians are not alone in this fight, Solace finally said. There are forces at work in the realms that we may not fully understand. The darkness seeks to take what is ours, to take everything we have protected, but we are not the only watchers in the realms. Lyra's brow furrowed in confusion. What do you mean? We are the Guardians. We are the protectors. Solace nodded slowly, his gaze turning toward the distant horizon where the light of the moon hung faintly in the sky. There are others who watch, others who have stood in silence for as long as we have. They are the silent watchers, the forces of nature that have always stood guard over the realms, even when we were unaware of them. For a moment, Lyra was silent, her thoughts racing as she tried to comprehend what Solace was suggesting. Silent watchers, beings who had stood in the background, unnoticed, their presence felt only in the smallest of ways. Could it be that the realms were not as alone as they had once believed? That there were other forces, other guardians, who had been waiting for the right moment to act? The other guardians, sensing the shift in the air, began to gather around them. Ilara, the guardian of the waters, spoke first, her voice carrying the weight of the ocean's depths. What do you mean, Solace? Who are these silent watchers? Solace turned to face her, his eyes filled with quiet resolve. The forces that govern the realms are not limited to those of us who have sworn oaths. There are ancient powers at work, powers that have always been there, watching, waiting for the right moment. The void has stirred them, just as it has stirred us. They may not be able to fight the darkness directly, but they can help us in ways we do not fully understand. Zephyros, the guardian of the winds, nodded thoughtfully. The winds carry whispers from all corners of the realms. Perhaps these watchers are the spirits of the world, the ancient forces that hold the balance in ways we cannot see. They may not speak with our voices, but they can still guide us. Igna, the guardian of flame, stepped forward, her flame burning brightly in the midst of the gathering. Then we must find them. We cannot afford to wait in silence any longer. If these watchers have the power to help us, we must seek them out. The guardians stood together, their hearts united by the knowledge that they were not alone. The silent watchers were a force they had never truly understood, but they knew now that they were part of the larger balance that governed the realms. And if they were to stand against the void, they would need to call upon every force that could help them. The realms were not silent, after all. They had always been watched, always been guarded by forces unseen, waiting for the right moment to act. And now that moment had come. The realms had always been governed by the delicate balance of the elements: earth, air, fire, and water. Each guardian was a representation of one of these forces, tied to its essence, its rhythm, its flow. Together, they formed a unity that maintained the harmony of the worlds. Yet as the void crept into the edges of the realms, the balance seemed to falter. The elements, once strong and resolute, now appeared fragile, like a thread about to break. Lyra, the guardian of light, stood at the heart of the circle, her eyes closed as she felt the pulse of the elements within her. The light that had always guided her, the warmth that had illuminated the path ahead, now felt dimmer, weaker. But as she reached deeper, she could still feel the threads of the elements, faint but present, intertwining within her. There was still power in the world. There was still hope. Solace, the guardian of shadow, stood beside her, his form blending with the dark corners of the world. His connection to the shadow was his strength, but now even the shadows seemed to retreat in the face of the void. The delicate balance between light and shadow had always been a constant, but now it felt as though the shadows were being drawn inward, swallowed by the encroaching darkness. The elements are struggling, Lyra said softly, her voice tinged with concern. The light is fading, the winds are growing still, and the waters are no longer flowing as they should. Solace nodded, his gaze distant. The void is not just an enemy, it is an imbalance. It is a force that disrupts everything it touches, a force that seeks to unravel the very fabric of the realms. It is not just the guardians who feel its effects, it is the elements themselves. Ilara, the guardian of the waters, stepped forward, her face drawn with the weight of the truth. I can feel it in the currents, in the oceans. The waters no longer flow with the same rhythm. They are being stilled, frozen by the void's presence. The tides no longer rise and fall as they should. Zephyros, the guardian of the winds, nodded solemnly, his eyes scanning the sky. The winds are no longer free. They are choked by the void, their currents slowed and heavy. The air itself feels thick, like it is no longer moving as it should. Igna, the guardian of flame, clenched her fists, the fire within her flickering with frustration. The flame burns, but it is not as bright as it once was. It flickers in the face of the darkness, its light waning with each passing moment. The elements are struggling to hold the balance. The guardians look to one another, each of them feeling the weight of the loss in their own hearts. The elements, their very essence, were being threatened. They had always been the foundation upon which the realm stood, the forces that kept the world in balance. Without them, the realms would fall into chaos. We cannot allow the void to consume the elements, Lyra said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. We must protect them, restore them. Without the elements, the realms will cease to exist as they were meant to be. We must call upon the very heart of the earth, the sky, the sea, and the flame. Solace stepped forward, his presence commanding yet calm. The elements are not just forces we control. They are living, breathing parts of the world. They have their own will, their own strength. We must reconnect with them, reawaken their power. If we are to defeat the void, we must first restore the balance. Ilara, the guardian of the waters, closed her eyes and reached out with her senses, feeling the pulse of the oceans deep within her. The waters were still, but there was a faint current, a whisper of life beneath the surface. The oceans had not abandoned them completely. They were merely waiting for the moment when the balance would be restored. The waters are not gone, Ilara said softly. They are waiting. They will rise again when we call upon them. Zephyros, the guardian of the winds, stood tall, his eyes turned to the sky. The winds have not abandoned us either. They are only stilled for now. The air is thick, but it will move again. We must call upon it, guide it back to its natural rhythm. Igna, the guardian of flame, held out her hands, feeling the flickering fire within her palms. The flame will burn brighter again. It is not gone. It is merely waiting for the moment when the darkness has been pushed back. Lyra looked at each of her companions, her heart swelling with the strength of their unity. The elements will return to their natural state. We will call upon them, guide them back into balance. Together, we will restore the flow of the realms. And so, with their resolve renewed, the guardians turned to face the void once more. They knew that the path ahead would not be easy. The void was relentless, and its presence was felt in every corner of the realms. But they also knew that the elements were still there, waiting for them to restore the balance, waiting for them to rekindle the flame of hope that had always burned at the heart of the realms. The elements were not just forces to be wielded, they were the very soul of the world, the foundation upon which all life rested. And as long as the guardians stood united, as long as they remained true to their oaths, the elements would not fail them. Together, they would call upon the earth, the air, the water, and the flame. Together, they would restore the balance and push back the darkness. The true strength of the guardians had never been measured by their individual powers or abilities, but by the bonds they shared. These bonds, forged over countless centuries of standing side by side, had become the heart of their unity, the force that had held them together through trials and tribulations. But now, as the void threatened the realms, and the very balance of the worlds was at stake, those bonds were being tested in ways they had never imagined. The darkness that pressed in from all sides sought not only to consume the light, the water, the fire, and the air, but to tear apart the very connections that held the guardians together. Lyra, the guardian of light, stood at the center of the circle, her heart heavy with the weight of their mission. She had always believed that the light she carried could guide them through the darkest times. But now, in the face of the void, she realized that the light alone was not enough. It was the bonds between them, the shared oaths, the trust they had placed in one another that would see them through. Without those bonds, there would be no light, no hope. Solace, the guardian of shadow, stood beside her, his eyes reflecting the same quiet determination that burned in Lyra's heart. The shadows he commanded were not just a force of darkness, they were a part of him, a part of the unity that connected them all. The bonds they shared, the silent understanding between them, were as essential to their strength as the elements themselves. And now, as the void sought to unravel everything they had fought for, those bonds were being tested. The void seeks to do more than consume the realms, Solus said, his voice low but filled with a quiet urgency. It seeks to divide us, to break the bonds we share. If it succeeds in that, we will have nothing left to fight for. Our unity is our greatest strength. Without it, the darkness will win. Lyra nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the first signs of the coming storm could be seen. The sky, once filled with the golden light of the sun, was now shrouded in a thick, oppressive darkness. The realms were being consumed, bit by bit, by the void. The light was fading, the winds were still, and the waters were no longer flowing with the same rhythm they once had. It was as though the very world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable clash between light and shadow. We cannot let the darkness divide us, Lyra said softly, her voice steady despite the turmoil that raged within her. The bonds we share are what make us strong. We are not just individual guardians. We are a family, united by our oaths, our love for the realms, and our commitment to one another. The void can try to tear us apart, but it will never succeed. We will stand together. Solace placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle but firm. You are right. Our bonds are unbreakable. We have stood together through everything, through countless trials, through the darkness, through the light, and we will stand together now. Ilara, the guardian of the waters, stepped forward, her eyes filled with quiet strength. She had always been a reflection of the waters she guarded, fluid, adaptable, and resilient. But even she could feel the weight of the growing darkness, the strain it placed on their unity. The waters were still, the currents no longer flowing with the same rhythm, and it seemed as though the very heart of the ocean had been stilled by the presence of the void. We cannot let the void take the waters, Ilara said, her voice filled with a quiet resolve. The waters are the lifeblood of the realms. Without them, there is no life. Without them, there is no balance. We must protect the waters, protect the very essence of what we are. Zephyros, the guardian of the winds, nodded in agreement. The winds, once free and untamed, now felt heavy, burdened by the presence of the void. The air was thick, stifling, as though the very breath of the realms was being choked by the growing darkness. But Zephyros refused to believe that the winds, like the waters, could be silenced forever. The winds had always been a part of him, a part of the balance that held the realms together. And as long as he had breath in his lungs, he would fight to keep them free. We will not let the void silence the winds, Zephyros said, his voice firm, carrying the weight of centuries of knowledge. The winds are the breath of the world, the message of the realms. They cannot be stilled. As long as we stand together, they will move again. Igna, the guardian of flame, stepped forward, her flame burning brightly despite the darkness that surrounded them. The flame had always been a symbol of creation, of life, and of renewal. But now, as the void crept closer, the flame flickered, its warmth fading beneath the shadow of the darkness. Yet Igna would not allow the flame to die. She had sworn to protect it, to guard it with her very life, and she would not falter now. The flame may flicker, Igna said, her voice unwavering, but it will not go out. The flame is the heart of creation, the spark that ignites life. As long as we stand together, we will keep the flame burning. The darkness cannot consume it. It cannot consume us. The guardians stood together, their hands joined, their hearts united. The bonds they shared were stronger than the darkness that sought to tear them apart. They were not just individuals, each standing alone against the storm. They were a family, bound by their oaths, their love for one another, and their commitment to the realms they had sworn to protect. We are not alone, Lyra said, her voice steady and filled with a quiet strength. Together, we are unbreakable. The void may seek to divide us, but we will not be divided. Our bonds are stronger than the darkness. We are the guardians, and we will stand together no matter what. And so, with their bonds reaffirmed and their hearts united, the guardians prepared to face the darkness once more. They knew that the road ahead would not be easy. The void was relentless, and the trials they would face would be unlike anything they had ever experienced. But they also knew that as long as they stood together, as long as their bonds remained unbroken, they could overcome anything. Together, they would protect the realms, and together, they would ensure that the light, the waters, the winds, and the flame would never be extinguished. The world had grown darker, the balance slipping ever further away. The realms, once vibrant and full of life, now felt like a shadow of their former selves. The air was thick with the presence of the void, a constant, oppressive force that seemed to stretch across every corner of the realms, pulling at the very fabric of existence. The guardians stood on the precipice, facing the rising darkness, knowing that their resolve would be tested like never before. But even as the void pressed closer, there was a quiet understanding that they were the last line of defense, the final bulwark against the encroaching shadow. For centuries, the Guardians had stood watch over the realms, their oaths unwavering, their hearts steadfast. They had watched as kingdoms rose and fell, as stars were born and died, and as the cycles of time continued their eternal march. But now, in the face of the void, they understood that their role was more than just that of protectors. They were the last sentinels, the eternal vigil that stood against the tide of darkness, no matter how relentless it became. Lyra, the guardian of light, stood at the edge of the circle, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The light she carried had always been a source of hope, a beacon that guided the realms through their darkest moments. But now the light felt dimmer, as though the darkness of the void was reaching into the very core of her being. She could feel the weight of the world upon her shoulders, the responsibility of holding back the darkness that threatened to swallow everything she had sworn to protect. And yet, in the deepest corners of her heart, Lyra knew that the light could never be extinguished. It had always been a part of her, and it would always remain, no matter how faint or distant it seemed. The light was not just a force, it was a promise to the realms, to her fellow guardians, and to herself that she would never give up, no matter the cost. Beside her stood Solace, the guardian of shadow, his presence as calm and steady as ever. The darkness he commanded was not a force to be feared, but one to be understood. He had always known the importance of balance, of maintaining the harmony between light and shadow. And now, as the void threatened to disrupt that balance, Solace could feel the weight of his role more than ever before. He was not just the guardian of the shadows, he was the keeper of the unseen, the silent protector who watched over the realms when no one else could. Solace, Lyra said softly, her voice filled with quiet determination. Do you ever wonder if this is the moment we've been waiting for? The final trial that will test everything we are? Solace looked at her, his eyes filled with the wisdom of centuries. I do not know, Lyra, but I do know this. We have always stood watch, and we will continue to do so. We are the eternal vigil, the ones who stand between the light and the dark, between life and death. The void may seek to destroy what we have built, but it will not succeed, not as long as we stand together. The words resonated in Lyra's heart, and for a moment she allowed herself to feel the warmth of their truth. The darkness was overwhelming, yes, but it was not unbeatable. Together, they had stood against countless trials, and together they would face this one as well. The void was a formidable enemy, but it had one weakness. It could not tear apart what was already whole, and the guardians were whole, their bond unbreakable. The other guardians, sensing the weight of the moment, began to gather around the circle. Ilara, the guardian of the waters, stood with her eyes closed, her hands gently resting on the surface of the still water. The waters had always been a reflection of the world, a fluid, ever-changing force that adapted to the rhythms of the realms. But now, the waters were still, and Ilara could feel the dissonance in their currents, the unnatural stillness that had taken root. The waters are waiting, Ilara said softly, her voice carrying the weight of her knowledge. They have always been the flow of life, the rhythm that keeps the realms in balance. But now they are still. The currents do not move as they should. The tides do not rise and fall with the same purpose. Zephyros, the guardian of the winds, nodded, his gaze turned upward toward the sky. The winds had always been free, carrying the voices of the realms across the skies, unbound by the forces that sought to control them. But now, even the winds seemed to be stifled, held back by the growing presence of the void. The winds are no longer free, Zephyros said, his voice filled with the quiet strength of the air itself. The currents of the world are stilled, choked by the darkness. But the winds will not be held forever. The air will move again. We must trust in that. Igna, the guardian of flame, stepped forward, her hands raised toward the flickering fire that burned in the center of the circle. The flame had always been her strength, a symbol of creation and destruction, of the light that burned in the hearts of all living things. But now the flame flickered uneasily, its warmth struggling to push back the encroaching cold of the void. The flame burns, but it is not as bright as it once was, Igna said, her voice steady but filled with determination. The darkness seeks to snuff it out, but it cannot. As long as we stand together, the flame will burn. The darkness may come, but it will not defeat us. We are the flame, and we will keep it burning. And so, with their hearts bound together, the guardians stood firm against the void, ready to face the trials that awaited them. They were the eternal vigil, the guardians who stood between light and shadow, life and death. The darkness might press closer, but as long as they remained united, they would stand strong. The void may have its power, but it had no hold on the hearts of the guardians. For as long as they stood together, the realms would remain, and the light would never fade. The darkness had gathered, its presence like a storm on the horizon, threatening to consume all that the guardians had fought for. It was not an enemy that could be seen or touched, but one that was felt deep within the heart of every realm, every living being. The void had spread across the worlds, and with each passing moment its grip tightened, choking the light, stilling the winds, drowning the waters, and dulling the flame. The realms, once vibrant and full of life, now stood on the edge of collapse. But the guardians were not willing to give up. They had sworn their oaths, pledged to protect the balance of the realms, and they would not falter now. They had stood together through countless trials, and this would be their greatest challenge. The void might seek to tear them apart, to undo everything they had built, but they would not allow it. They were the guardians, and they would stand firm in the face of the coming storm. Lyra, the guardian of light, stood at the forefront of the circle, her heart heavy but resolute. She could feel the weight of the realms pressing upon her, the fear of what might come, the uncertainty that had taken root in her soul. The light she carried had always been a source of strength, a beacon that guided them through the darkest of times. But now, the light seemed to flicker, its warmth fading under the shadow of the void. The darkness pressed in from all sides, suffocating the very light that had once been their greatest hope. Yet as she stood there, surrounded by the other guardians, Lyra knew that the light would never go out. It could flicker, it could dim, but it could never be extinguished as long as they stood together. The strength of their bond, their unity, was far more powerful than the void could ever be. And it was that bond, that shared purpose, that would carry them through the final stand. We cannot let the darkness win, Lyra said, her voice steady, though filled with the weight of what they faced. We have always stood together, and we will stand together now. The realms may be fading, but we will fight for them. We will fight for the light. Solace, the guardian of shadow, stepped forward, his form blending with the darkness around them. He had always been the counterbalance to Lyra's light, the keeper of the shadows, the silent protector of the unseen. But now, as the void pressed closer, even the shadows seemed to be shrinking, retreating before the encroaching darkness. The darkness may be powerful, Solace said, his voice calm but filled with quiet strength. But it cannot defeat us. It can consume the light, still the winds, drown the waters, and dim the flame, but it cannot break us. As long as we remain united, as long as we stand together, the void will never have the power to undo what we have built. The other guardians nodded, their faces filled with the same quiet resolve. Ilara, the guardian of the waters, stepped forward, her hands resting on the still surface of the ocean. The waters had once flowed freely, but now they were stagnant, still, waiting for the moment when they could rise again. The waters may be still, Ilara said, her voice soft but unwavering, but they will not remain so forever. The currents will flow again. The tide will rise. As long as we stand together, the waters will return to their natural rhythm. Zephyros, the guardian of the winds, raised his head to the sky, his eyes searching the heavens. The winds had once been his domain, free and untamed, carrying the whispers of the realms across the skies. But now the air was thick, stagnant, as if even the winds were held captive by the darkness. Yet Zephyros refused to believe that the winds could be silenced forever. He had felt their power, their freedom, and he knew that the winds would rise again. The winds may be still now, Zephyros said, his voice carrying the weight of the air itself, but they will not remain so. The storm will come, and the winds will carry us through it. We must hold on, for as long as the winds blow, there is hope. Igna, the guardian of flame, stood tall, her hands raised to the flickering fire at the center of the circle. The flame had always been her source of strength, a symbol of creation, of warmth, and of life. But now even the flame seemed to be struggling, its light flickering in the face of the void. The darkness had sought to snuff it out, but Igna would not let it go out. She had sworn to protect the flame, and she would do so until her last breath. The flame may flicker, Igna said, her voice steady and resolute, but it will not be extinguished. It burns within us all, and as long as we stand together, the flame will never go out. The guardians stood together, their hands joined, their hearts united. The darkness may have pressed in from all sides, but they knew that as long as they remained united, as long as they held on to the bonds that had kept them strong, the void would never win. They would fight with everything they had, for the realms, for the light, for the elements, and for one another. The battle that awaited them would not be easy. The void was relentless, and the path ahead would be fraught with danger and uncertainty. But the guardians knew that they could not let the darkness consume the realms. They had sworn to protect them, and they would fight with every ounce of strength they had. Together, they would stand against the void. Together, they would face the final stand. As the void pressed on, encroaching further into the heart of the realms, the guardians knew that the final battle was upon them. It was not a battle of weapons or armies. It was a battle of wills, of light and darkness, of the very forces that had shaped the world. The realms they had sworn to protect were on the brink of collapse, teetering on the edge of oblivion. The void had spread its influence like a shadow, suffocating everything in its path. But the guardians, despite the overwhelming odds, stood firm. They were the last line of defense, the final hope for a dying world. Lyra, the guardian of light, stood at the center of the circle, her heart heavy with the weight of what they were about to face. She had always believed in the power of the light, in the hope it brought to the realms. But now, as the light she carried flickered in the face of the darkness, she realized that hope alone was not enough. The darkness they faced was not a force that could be overcome with light alone. It was a force that sought to consume everything, to turn the world into nothingness. The guardians had stood together for so long, their bonds unbreakable, their purpose clear. But now, as they prepared for the final stand, they understood that they were not just fighting for the realms, they were fighting for each other. The bond they shared was their greatest strength, and it was that bond that would carry them through the coming storm. Solace, the guardian of shadow, stood beside Lyra, his presence a quiet anchor in the midst of the growing chaos. The shadows that had always been his domain now seemed to deepen, to stretch farther than ever before. He had always understood the balance between light and dark, but now even the shadows seemed to be retreating, swallowed by the growing presence of the void. The darkness was no longer just a force to be understood. It was a force that sought to erase everything, even the shadows that had always been a part of the world. The void is not just a force of darkness, Solace said, his voice low and steady. It is a force of nothingness, of oblivion. It seeks to erase everything, to undo everything we have built. But we will not let it. We will not let it consume the light, the waters, the flames, or the winds. We will not let it erase our bonds. Ilara, the guardian of the waters, looked out over the still ocean, her hands resting gently on the surface of the water. The waves had not moved in days, the once constant ebb and flow of the tides now stilled by the void's presence. The ocean was no longer the life-giving force it had once been. It was a silent, waiting expanse, as though even the waters themselves were holding their breath. The waters have always been a reflection of life, Ilara said, her voice filled with quiet sorrow. But now they are still. The currents are slow, the tides stagnant. The ocean waits for us to restore its rhythm, to bring the flow of life back to the world. We cannot let the void steal that from us. Zephyros, the guardian of the winds, stood tall, his eyes turned to the sky, which had once been filled with the whisper of the winds. Now the air was thick and still, the winds that had carried the voices of the realms, stilled by the oppressive weight of the darkness. The winds had always been free, untamed, a symbol of movement and change. But now they seemed to be choking on the darkness, their voice drowned in the silence of the void. The winds are not gone, Zephyros said, his voice a whisper carried on the still air. They are only waiting. The air will move again, but we must fight for it. We must fight for the freedom of the realms, for the winds that carry life and messages across the worlds. Igna, the guardian of flame, stood by the fire, her hands raised toward the flickering flame. The flame had always been her strength, a source of creation, a symbol of life and warmth. But now, as the void spread, even the flame seemed to struggle, its light flickering and dimming in the face of the encroaching darkness. The flame has not gone out, Igna said, her voice filled with quiet determination. It may flicker, it may waver, but it will never go out. The flame is life. As long as we stand together, the flame will burn. We will protect it. We will protect the light. The guardians stood together, their hearts and spirits united in the face of the darkness that threatened to consume the realms. The battle ahead would be unlike any they had faced before. The void was a force unlike any other, a force that sought to erase everything the guardians had fought for. But they knew, deep within their hearts, that they could not let that happen. They had always been more than just the sum of their powers. They had always been united by their bonds, by the shared love they had for the realms and for each other. The void may seek to divide them, to tear them apart, but as long as they stood together, they would never be broken. The time had come for the final stand. The realms had been through countless trials, and the guardians had always stood firm. But now, in the face of the void, they understood that this battle would determine everything. They would either stand together and protect the realms, or they would fall, and the realms would fall with them. With their hearts united and their purpose clear, the guardians prepared for the final battle. They would fight for the light, for the waters, for the winds, and for the flame, and they would fight for each other. The realms stood at the brink of destruction. The void had spread its influence across every corner of the world, darkening the skies, stilling the winds, silencing the oceans, and dimming the flame that had once burned bright. The very fabric of existence seemed to be unraveling, each moment drawing them closer to oblivion. Yet in the heart of the storm, the guardians remained, their bonds unbroken, their resolve unshaken. They had sworn to protect the realms, and no matter the cost, they would see that oath fulfilled. The final battle had begun, and the guardians stood at the threshold of destiny. Lyra, the guardian of light, stood at the front of the circle, her hands raised toward the sky. The light she had always carried, the light that had guided them through the darkest of times, was flickering, but it had not gone out. It could not. The light was more than just a force. It was hope, and as long as there was hope, the guardians would not be defeated. Beside her, Solace, the guardian of shadow, stood tall, his form blending with the encroaching darkness. The void had sought to consume everything, the light, the air, the water, the flame, but it could not consume the essence of the guardians. They were more than just individual forces. They were a unity, a collective strength that could not be broken, and as long as they stood together, the darkness would not prevail. Together, Lyra whispered, her voice carrying the weight of their shared oath. We stand as one. Together, we will face this darkness. Together, we will protect the realms. Solace nodded, his eyes unwavering. The void seeks to divide us, but we will not be divided. The darkness may press against us, but it will never break us. We are the guardians, and as long as we stand united, the light will always find a way. The other guardians gathered around them, their faces filled with the same quiet determination. Ilara, the guardian of the waters, stood with her hands resting gently on the still surface of the ocean. The waters had once flowed freely, but now they were stilled, waiting for the moment when they would rise again. The currents had been disrupted, the rhythm of the tides broken, but Ilara knew that the waters would return. They always did. The waters are waiting, Ilara said softly. The tide will rise again. The currents will flow once more. We must stand firm, for the waters will not be still forever. Zephyros, the guardian of the winds, looked to the sky, his eyes searching for the winds that had always carried the voices of the realms. The air was thick, stagnant, but Zephyros knew that the winds would return. They always did. The winds could not be silenced forever. The air would move again. The winds are not gone, Zephyros said, his voice strong and steady. They are only stilled for now. The storm will pass, and the winds will carry us through it. We must hold on, for as long as the winds blow, there is hope. Igna, the guardian of flame, stood near the center of the circle, the flame burning brightly in her hands. The flame had always been her source of strength, a symbol of life and renewal. But now, even the flame seemed to struggle against the encroaching darkness. It flickered, its light wavering under the weight of the void, yet Igna refused to let it go out. The flame was her strength, and as long as she stood, the flame would burn. The flame may flicker, Igna said, her voice filled with quiet resolve, but it will not go out. The flame is the heart of creation, the spark that ignites life. We will protect it. We will protect the light. Together, the guardians stood in the circle, their hands joined, their hearts united. The darkness pressed in from all sides, but they knew that as long as they stood together, as long as their bonds remained unbroken, they would have the strength to face whatever came. The void could take the light, still the waters, choke the winds, and dim the flame, but it could not break their unity. The darkness might try to consume them, but as long as the guardians stood united, the realms would endure. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Lyra allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The battle they faced was unlike any they had ever known, and the outcome was uncertain. But the Guardians had never been ones to shy away from the impossible. They had stood against the darkness before, and they would stand against it again. This time, they would not just fight for the realms, they would fight for each other. The realms may tremble, Lyra said, her voice steady despite the growing weight of the darkness. The winds may stop, the waters may still, the flame may flicker, but we will not be broken. We will stand together, for as long as we stand together, the light will never fade. Solace stepped forward, his shadow blending with the growing darkness. The void may try to consume us, he said, his voice filled with quiet strength. But we are the guardians. We are more than just light and shadow, fire and water. We are the heart of the realms, the guardians who protect the balance. The void may take many things from us, but it will never take the bond we share. And with that, the guardians stepped forward, united in purpose and unyielding in their resolve. The void would rise, but so too would the guardians. Together, they would protect the realms, and together, they would ensure that the light, the water, the wind, and the flame would never be extinguished. Their return was not just a return to the realms, but a return to their true purpose. The final battle had begun, and the guardians would stand against the darkness, united in strength, in love, and in the unwavering belief that as long as they stood together, nothing could defeat them. Thank you for journeying through the stories of the Guardians with me tonight. As the realms stand on the precipice of destruction, we are reminded that even in the darkest of times, there is strength in unity, hope in light, and power in the bonds we share. The Guardians, though tested, have proven that their resolve is unbreakable, their light eternal. Their fight is a reflection of the struggle we all face in moments of uncertainty. Whether light or shadow, water or flame, we are never truly alone. May the warmth of their flame guide you through your own darkness. May the winds of hope carry you forward, and may the waters of resilience flow gently within your soul. Let the legacy of the Guardians remind you that even when faced with the unknown, there is always a way forward, together. As you drift into sleep, let your heart be light and know that the strength of the Guardians will always be with you. Good night.